And you say that there's these kind of three forces for cultural kind of like authority, let's say, in the 60s, and they're in conflict, and we come out of the 60s in a different arrangement. So you described them, I think, a minute ago as like the legacy of the Enlightenment, rationalism. Science is really the child of that from an empirical perspective. You've got Romanticism, which you say doesn't really fully come to roost until the 60s. Then you've got Orthodox, traditional, historical Christian faith on the one hand, and they're in like a triangle tug of war sort of thing. And so is the 60s, you say the ascendance there, does Romanticism win, or it just comes into full view for the first time? Does it like kick Christianity's behind, or like what happens?
So let me recast what you just said. I start my journey into Western thought, and I start reading about Western thought. And very quickly, this picture began to emerge that you can understand the dynamic, the cultural dynamic in the West for the last 2 to 3 centuries. If you think of it as a dynamic between three really distinct ways of looking at the world. One is the worldview that came out of the Enlightenment, this, call it materialistic science. So, a commitment to science and a commitment to a materialistic view of the world. A second is a romantic view, and a romantic view arises as we come to the end of the Enlightenment, and thinkers look at the Enlightenment and they're saying something's missing here. Mm-hmm. This doesn't give us a complete view of humanity. So they try to re-inject what the Enlightenment cut out. And you then have Christianity as a third worldview that isn't compatible with either one of those two. It's certainly not compatible with the Enlightenment because it believes that there's a God. The Enlightenment doesn't. But it's also not compatible with Romanticism in the sense that, and Charles Taylor talks about this, in the sense that when you come out of the Enlightenment and you've got this dissatisfaction with the flatness, with the emptiness, with the lack of the dehumanizing effects of that period, there's a motivation to find something new, but it gets caught between, well, I don't really want to go back to Christianity because it's orthodox, it's rigid, it's authoritarian, it's got these fixed views. I don't want to go there, but I don't want to go to the Enlightenment. So I'm finding this middle space. And Romanticism kind of fills that middle space. The whole Romantic movement fills that space. So then if you say, so that becomes a kind of a thesis, that becomes an operating hypothesis. And so then you say, okay, if that's an operating, does it work? So then, I go into, well, what really happened in the Enlightenment? What really happened with Romanticism? What is Christianity? How do those three really look when you compare them to each other? Is there a tension between them? Can you really say that they're very different worldviews that are in tension with each other? And then if you do, then the next part is, how does that help you understand what happened in the culture? So if you approach the 60s and you say, if I take that sort of triangular look, three worldviews in tension with each other, and I say, how does that help me understand what happened in the 60s? It allows me to step back and say, well, what did America look like before the 60s? And so that gets you to the notion that, well, strong Christian presence, science was certainly present. Romanticism was maybe, there, but sort of like light. The shift that I believe took place during the 60s is that Christianity became marginalized. Christianity lost favor. And so there's this book by Putnam and Campbell called American Grace. And they describe the 60s as an earthquake. The 60s, where we went from a nation where it was sort of an expectation that everybody was Christian to an expectation that you're sort of looked at with a certain kind of skepticism if you're a Christian. And so what comes out of the 60s is all of a sudden this burst of all kinds of new views of spirituality. So the human potential movement. You got the Beach Boys, Mike Love becoming TM. You've got the Beatles going to see yogas. You got this popularity of Buddhism. And then you got Tom Wolfe writing this famous article in Forbes about the me generation. And what he's describing there is this just proliferation of different attempts by people to find a spiritual center in some place other than Christianity, but one that doesn't exist in the Enlightenment. Daniel Yankelovich says that, he writes a book in 81, and he says the one defining feature of the post-60s period is this quest for the self. The search for who I am. Those are all aspects of what it means to have shifted our focus and to have normalized what I would call this romantic way of looking at the world.